Number 17 kept entire villages alive through 2 world wars on ingredients that cost less than a lira. Number 8 was called peasant food for 200 years. Rome restaurants now charge 24 euros for it. This is what survival tasted like. Number 30, pane e sale, marks the bare minimum of survival in wartime Sicily. When municipal ration cards in Palermo were cut again in 1943, families faced empty cupboards and the question of how to feed children with almost nothing left. Stale bread, sometimes days old, sometimes chipped from the last hard loaf, became the meal. Salt, measured carefully from a dwindling allowance, was the only addition. No oil, no broth, no comfort. Just bread and salt, eaten slowly, sometimes softened with a little water if teeth or age demanded it. Ration bulletins from 1943 record the shrinking salt allocations, and mothers broke bread into pieces to make it last. This was not tradition, but necessity. Pane e sale stands as the threshold of deprivation, where the effort to preserve dignity meant making a meal from the last 2 things that remained. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 29, bruschetta semplice, marks the moment when a single spoon of olive oil could change the taste of survival. Stale bread, already hard from days on the shelf, was sliced and rubbed with a raw clove of garlic, sometimes just the cut edge, never a whole bulb wasted. 1 measured spoon of oil, bartered from the Neapolitan docks or saved from the month's ration, was stretched across the slices. The oil did not provide comfort, only a thin sheen of fat and the memory of flavor. Oral histories from dock workers recall mothers using bruschetta as a quick fix when hunger pressed and cupboards were empty. There was no protein, no luxury, only the resourcefulness of adding the smallest trace of richness to keep children from going to bed with nothing but bread and salt. Bruschetta semplice stands as the first fragile improvement, still stark, but touched by the hope of something more. Number 28, minestra di acqua, emerges from the siege days of Sicily in 1943, when Allied landings choked the grain supply and left families with only the remnants of yesterday's bread. Water, stale bread, and a pinch of salt were the ingredients that stood between hunger and faint hope. Mothers boiled crumbs in thin water, coaxing a broth from what would have been swept from the table. The soup offered little more than warmth and the illusion of fullness. Family testimonies recall children waiting in silence as pots simmered, the scent of boiling bread filling kitchens stripped of all else. Minestra di acqua was not a comfort, but a refusal to waste even the last scrap. In a world where every crumb counted, survival meant patience and the will to turn nothing into something warm. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 27, farinata, is a flatbread made from chickpea flour, water, and olive oil, nothing more. In Genoa's 14th century tax ledgers, chickpea flour appears as a staple for those who could not afford wheat. During wartime, when grain shipments stopped and bread vanished from the table, families turned to this dense, protein-rich batter. Dock workers and laborers pooled their rations, pouring the mixture into communal pans and baking it over wood fires. Each slice delivered more calories and protein than the same weight of bread, making it a rare shield against hunger when little else remained. Farinata was never a delicacy, but a necessity, thick, filling, and made to last through the hardest days. In times when oil was scarce, even a thin drizzle was enough to keep the bread from sticking and to stretch one meal into the next. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 26, spaghetti aglio e olio, was the meal that stretched a single spoonful of oil to feed an entire family. In Naples, dock workers coming off the night shift would gather around a pot of boiling water, adding only dried spaghetti and a clove or 2 of garlic. The olive oil, precious and rationed and sometimes bartered for at the docks, was measured by the ladle, not the bottle. Diaries from the waterfront describe how 1 ladle of oil was stirred into the pot, coating each strand just enough to carry the scent of fat and garlic through a bowl of plain starch. This was not minimalist cuisine, but survival by micro-fat, flavoring bulk calories with the bare minimum. Spaghetti aglio e olio marked the point where hunger met ingenuity, and endurance was measured by how far a spoon of oil could be stretched. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 25, pasta alla puttanesca, belongs to the taverns and cramped kitchens of the 1930s in Naples, where the city's poor relied on what the pantry could hold through weeks of scarcity. Dried pasta, preserved tomatoes, and cheap brined olives and capers. These were the ingredients that survived when markets closed and fresh produce disappeared. The sauce's sharp, salty punch was not a flourish, but a necessity, masking the taste of stale wheat and covering up the absence of meat or fish. Wartime price bulletins show olives and capers sold for less than half the price of fresh tomatoes, making them a practical choice for those with little to spend. In these quarters, pungency replaced freshness. The pungent aroma filled the alleys, signaling a meal that owed nothing to luxury, only to the endurance of families who made flavor from what would last. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 24, pasta con le sarde, stands as a meal shaped by the tides and the reach of the canning industry along the Sicilian coast. Pasta, sardines, and wild fennel, three ingredients that brought protein to families who otherwise faced months with little more than bread or beans. During wartime, sardine canneries along the shoreline shipped tins inland, sometimes traded for grain or vegetables. In the hill towns, mothers stretched a single tin across a pot of pasta, adding foraged fennel when gardens stood empty. The fish, packed in oil or salt, gave a rare taste of the sea to those who had never seen it. This was not the Mediterranean diet of modern brochures, but a practice of survival, making canned fish last, foraging the hills for greens, and feeding children with what the coast could spare. Pasta con le sarde is a record of hunger, patience, and the quiet dignity of making a meal from what could be carried upriver. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 23, caponata di melanzane, was born in the gardens and backyards of post-war Palermo, where every vegetable was precious and nothing could be wasted. Eggplant, tomatoes, and olives, three ingredients brought together in a slow-cooked stew, offered a rare burst of vitamins when fresh produce was scarce and hunger stretched into summer. Families gathered at dusk to preserve what little the garden gave, simmering the mixture in oil or brine to extend its life across the week. Olive brine supplied both salt and fat when both were hard to come by. Caponata was not a festive antipasto, but a strategy for survival, a way to keep children from falling ill when meat and beans ran out. The discipline of preservation, the patience to wait for flavor, and the refusal to waste even a bruised tomato, these were the virtues that made caponata more than a recipe. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 22, panzanella povera, stands as the cold bread salad that marked the careful planning of Tuscan peasant kitchens. Stale bread, never thrown out, was saved for weeks. Crusts and hard ends set aside as a hedge against days when fuel for cooking ran low. In the heat of summer, when firewood was scarce and the midday sun punished any thought of boiling soup, families soaked the bread in water and vinegar, then mixed it with chopped tomato and slices of raw onion. The acid and moisture revived what was nearly inedible, turning hard crumbs into something filling without a spark of fire. Panzanella was not a picnic dish, but a deliberate act of thrift, a way to stretch the last resources of the cupboard across the seasons. Each bowl was a record of patience, of planning ahead for the moment when nothing else could be cooked. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 21, ribollita, stands as a testament to the patience and foresight required when hunger pressed hardest in the valleys of Umbria and Tuscany. Bread, cannellini beans, and kale, each ingredient chosen for its ability to stretch, to fill, to last. The soup began as yesterday's meal, then returned to the pot, reboiled until the bread thickened and the beans broke down, surrendering every last calorie. Parish registers from the 1940s describe nights when families pooled their stale bread and beans, sharing what little remained so that no one would be left with only water. With each reheating, ribolita grew heavier, more nourishing, saving precious firewood and turning scraps into sustenance. This was not rustic comfort. It was survival by strategy, a kitchen ruled by thrift, where Nonna's planning meant the difference between hunger and one more day endured. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 20. Pasta alla Gricia stands at the edge of survival and the beginning of a new economy in the hills of Lazio. 3 ingredients: dried pasta, guanciale, and pecorino cheese, meant more than flavor. They were the result of a system built on animal husbandry and preservation. Guanciale, cured from pork jowl, was salt-rubbed and hung to dry for months, a tactic to stretch rare animal fat through the leanest seasons. Pecorino, made from sheep's milk, came in small allocations. Its sharpness was meant to flavor an entire cauldron with just a handful. Cheese was rationed by the gram on post-war tables, and the cured meat's shelf life made it a lifeline when eggs vanished from the market. There was no egg here, only the discipline of preservation and the memory of hunger. Pasta alla Gricia marked the threshold, enough animal fat to flavor the pot, enough cheese to keep children fed, but never more than necessity allowed. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 19. Spaghetti alla carbonara carries the weight of clandestine survival in Rome's battered kitchens of 1944. This was not the creamy, egg-laden dish that later myth would claim. No Allied rations, no powdered eggs, no American bacon. Instead, families risked barter and black market trade, offering up linens or heirlooms for a slab of guanciale. The cured pork, when it could be found, was diced and rendered with a handful of dried spaghetti and a shaving of pecorino, both rationed and precious. Wartime food columns from Rome describe mothers stretching a single piece of pork to flavor a pot for 6, the cheese measured by the gram. In these kitchens, carbonara was an act of quiet defiance, a way to bring animal fat to the table when official markets had none. The meal's richness set it apart from the bare-bones Gricia, but its existence depended on secrecy and sacrifice. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 18. Pasta e ceci stands as the meal that made plant protein the backbone of rural survival. In kitchens where meat had vanished, a pot of dried chickpeas, soaked overnight to soften the shell, became the main source of strength. Chickpeas, stored in sealed jars for up to a year, waited in the pantry as insurance against hunger. Each morning, mothers poured the soaking water into the cooking pot, refusing to waste even the faintest trace of nutrition. Dried pasta, broken into pieces, joined the simmering chickpeas with a clove of garlic, filling the house with the scent of endurance. There was no broth except what the beans gave. This was not a dish of abundance, but of patience, waiting for beans to soften and stretching a handful to feed many. Pasta e ceci marked the moment when legumes became a lifeline, carrying families through lean seasons. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 17. Polenta e formaggio stands as the meal that fed entire mountain villages through winters when nothing else could be bought. Cornmeal, water, and the smallest ration of hard cheese, often just a rind shaved thin, became the daily bread of the Veneto and Emilia-Romagna. In 1944, provincial price bulletins recorded cornmeal at 0.12 lira per kilogram, a fraction of the cost of wheat, and far cheaper than any other staple. Cheese, once a symbol of celebration, was pooled by neighbors under the eyes of the police, who documented families dividing a single wheel into dozens of portions for survival. Parish ledgers from Treviso list 10 kilograms of polenta and half a kilogram of cheese as a month's rations for a family of 6. There was no abundance, only the slow patience of stirring cornmeal into a heavy pot, scraping every last crumb of cheese to flavor what would otherwise be tasteless bulk. Today, a kilogram of hard cheese sells for 16 euros, But in those years, it was the only luxury a family allowed itself all week. Polenta e formaggio is not a story of rustic comfort, but a record of endurance. Whole communities surviving on cents, on sharing, and on the refusal to let anyone starve. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 16. Frittata di cipolle stands as a lesson in making little stretch far in the Calabrian hills. When eggs were rationed to just 3 a week for a family, onions became the tool for dilution, a cheap crop pulled from rocky soil, sliced thin, and stewed in olive oil until sweet. The onions swelled the pan, absorbing oil and turning a scant handful of eggs into a meal that could feed 6. Wartime ration tables from 1943 show egg allocations so meager that families learned to rely on what the land gave most freely. In these kitchens, the frittata was never a brunch luxury. It was a strategy to bulk out the protein, fill the stomach, and keep hunger at bay for one more night. The ratio of onion to egg was not a matter of taste, but of survival. The dignity lay in the patience to wait for onions to soften, in the quiet acceptance that the egg was only there to hold the rest together. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 15. Castagnaccio stands as the mountain's answer to hunger when grain could not be found. Chestnut flour, water, and a spoon of oil. These were the only ingredients available to families scattered through the Apennines, where wheat was too precious to waste, and winter cut villages off for weeks. The chestnut harvest, gathered each autumn, was dried over slow-burning fire pits and stored in sacks, insurance against the long hunger season. Communal milling days brought families together to grind the smoky sweet flour, each household taking home enough to see them through the cold. Castagnaccio was not a festive cake, but a dense, earthy slab, barely sweet, heavy with starch, and just enough fat to make it sliceable. There was no sugar, no fruit, only the memory of trees that kept villages alive when markets failed. In these mountains, chestnuts meant independence from grain imports and the power to survive on what the forest gave. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 14. Gnocchi di patate marks the point where the mountain garden replaced the wheat field as the source of survival. In the high villages of the Alps and the Apennines, potatoes grew where grain could not, stored through the winter in cellars dug into the earth. Families scraped together potatoes, a handful of flour, and a single pat of butter. No eggs, no sauce, nothing wasted. The dough was shaped into dumplings and boiled, then finished with just enough butter to glaze the whole batch. Oral histories from mountain households recall gnocchi as a rare comfort, not for its richness, but for the way it filled the stomach when hunger pressed hardest. The potatoes' yield made it possible to feed a family at altitude, stretching a sack through months of snow. Gnocchi di patate was not a festive meal, but a record of endurance, proof that even the humblest tuber with patience and thrift could keep a village alive. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 13. Minestrone di legumi stands as the mountain's answer to the long, hungry winter. A pot filled with nothing but mixed dried beans, water, and stale bread became the backbone of survival in the Apennine and Alpine valleys. Monastery ledgers from the 12th century record sacks of chickpeas, lentils, and fava beans stored for the cold months, each type hedging against the failure of a single crop. When the snow closed roads and markets vanished, families gathered what was left, boiling every variety of pulse together until the soup thickened with starch and fragments of hard bread. This was not a celebration of abundance, but a calculation, combining beans to create a more complete protein, wringing every nutrient from the year's harvest. The minestrone's heaviness was not comfort, but necessity, a hedge against hunger, a lesson in patience, and a quiet record of endurance. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 12. Risotto al burro stands as the meal that transformed the Po Plains rice harvest into quiet comfort during years of rationing. Rice, The cheapest grain in Lombardy and Veneto filled pantries when wheat was out of reach. Families boiled it in thin broth, sometimes just water and a pinch of salt, waiting for each grain to surrender its starch. When the pot was pulled from the fire, a single pat of butter was stirred in, melting into the rice and turning bland starch into something children would eat without complaint. Wartime kitchen manuals from 1942 advised mothers to save the last bit of butter for this moment, insisting that even a small knob could coax flavor and fullness from nearly empty cupboards. Risotto al burro is not the creamy luxury found in modern trattorias, but the memory of a meal stretched by patience and thrift. A bowl that softened hunger with the smallest trace of fat. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 11. Pasta al sugo di pomodoro secco preserves the taste of summer through the long, lean winter. In the hill towns of Calabria, women spent August slicing tomatoes and laying them on rooftop racks, letting the sun draw out every drop of moisture. The dried slices, stored in jars or sewn together on string, became a lifeline when gardens lay barren and markets failed. In the dark months, a handful of dried tomato, reconstituted in boiling water and swirled with oil, became the only sauce left to flavor a pot of pasta. No cheese, no herbs, just the dense, concentrated memory of a harvest that had to last until spring. Letters from Calabrian migrants describe mothers mailing jars of dried pomodori to sons in America, a taste of home that survived the journey better than any fresh fruit. Each plate was a testament to the labor of preservation, the patience to wait, and the refusal to let anything go to waste. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 10. Pesto alla Genovese traces its roots to the narrow terraces and wild hillsides of Liguria, where families leaned on what the land gave freely. Basil grew untended between stone walls, while pine nuts were gathered by hand from the forests above the sea. A slow, careful task that turned foraging into a necessity, not a pastime. Olive oil, pressed in communal mills, was measured by the spoonful, never wasted. In the lean years, a handful of basil, a pocketful of pine nuts, and a trickle of oil became a paste that stretched meager rations of pasta into a meal. There was no cheese, no abundance, only the green scent of survival and the knowledge passed down from Nonna, who knew every plant and tree on the hillside. Terrace surveys from the 1940s document these small gardens and the families who coaxed flavor from the thinnest soil. Pesto alla Genovese was not a luxury, but a lesson in how hunger teaches the value of every leaf and seed. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 9. Pasta e fagioli stands as the weekday meal that filled Italian tables when little else remained. Dried pasta, beans, and a spoon of oil were all that was needed to make a thick, starchy stew, one pot shared by all, with the youngest served first and parents eating last. Municipal food surveys from the 1940s show that nearly half of working-class families in Rome and Naples relied on pasta e fagioli as a daily staple. The ritual of serving, with eldest children portioning bowls before the adults, was a quiet acknowledgement of hunger's hierarchy. There was no meat, no cheese, only the slow simmer of beans breaking down into starch, turning water into something that could stretch across the week. In these kitchens, pasta e fagioli was not a recipe, but a necessity, a calculation of how far a sack of beans could go. The meal's endurance marks the point where survival became routine, and the act of sharing a pot was the only comfort left. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. In 8th place, cacio e pepe stands as a monument to the distance between hunger and fashion. In the years of war and rationing, shepherds carried shards of pecorino in their pockets, scraping the cheese into boiled pasta and dusting it with black pepper. The cheese was measured in grams, sometimes rationed at just 0.002 euros by today's value. Barely enough to flavor a pot, never enough for comfort. Black pepper, once a cheap import, was chosen not for taste, but for how it masked the blandness of dried pasta. Today, Cacio e pepe appears on city menus at 30 or 40 euros a plate, its poverty rewritten as culinary heritage. The dish that once kept children from starving is now a spectacle for tourists, priced 1,000 times higher than a wartime portion. This is not an evolution, but a commodification, hunger repackaged as luxury, the memory of hardship sold as experience. The dignity of survival is lost in translation, traded for a story that forgets why the cheese was so scarce. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 7. Zuppa di lenticchie was the meal that parish nurses recorded as the first line of defense when a child fell ill or a mother could no longer afford meat. Lentils, sold by the handful in open-air markets or measured out from a neighbor's jar, were boiled with nothing more than water and a sliced onion. The soup was ready in less than an hour, an urgent advantage when hunger could not wait for beans to soften overnight. Relief ledgers from parish kitchens in Umbria and Lazio list lentil soup as the most frequent request from families on the edge, especially in the winter months when bread ran out. There was no fat, no luxury, only the promise of plant protein delivered quickly enough to keep a child on their feet. Zuppa di lenticchie offered no comfort beyond warmth and the hope that tomorrow might bring a little more. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 6. Fave e cicoria stands as a record of hunger met with knowledge of the land. Broad beans, wild chicory, and oil were the three ingredients that shaped the springtime diet of poor families in Puglia and central Italy. Children were sent into the fields to gather chicory, learning to distinguish the bitter greens from poisonous lookalikes under the watchful eye of their grandmothers. The bitterness of the chicory, boiled and drained, was not a culinary flourish, but a way to rouse an appetite dulled by monotony and want. Broad beans, dried and stored from the last harvest, were simmered until soft, then mashed with a thin stream of oil, if any could be spared. Ethnographic records describe how the foraged greens doubled the volume of the meal, filling stomachs when beans alone would not suffice. Fave e cicoria was not a dish of plenty, but a lesson in survival passed down through the hands and eyes of Nonna, who knew every plant by name. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 5. Pane e latte marks the meal mothers turn to when a child's fever climbed or an elder's hands shook from hunger. Bread, milk, and a pat of butter, 3 ingredients rationed with care, reserved for the sick room or for those too frail to chew hard crusts. In rural Italy, nurses recommended this mixture as a gentle food for recovery, but the reality was often starker. Milk was scarce, delivered in bottles only when the cows had calved or when a neighbor's charity allowed. Letters from migrants described the heartbreak of sending for milk, hoping it would reach home in time to soothe a child's cough. The bread, always old, was softened in hot milk, sometimes with a slip of butter if any could be spared. Pane e latte was not comfort, but a gesture of care, a mother's way of rationing hope when the cupboard was nearly bare. The act of feeding the ill with what little remained carried the weight of responsibility and the quiet fear of loss. This meal stands as a reminder of the tenderness that endured even when there was almost nothing left to give. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 4. Gnocchi di pane stands as the weekly reckoning with waste in households that could afford none. Every stale crust, every heel of bread too hard to chew was collected through the week, never thrown out, never forgotten. On the day when the larder was swept clean, these scraps were soaked, pressed, and bound together with a single egg and a handful of grated cheese, if any could be spared. Family recipe notebooks from Emilia-Romagna record that 1 egg, beaten with water, could stretch to bind a dozen dumplings, enough to feed a family. The dough was rolled and shaped with hands that measured hunger by the crumb. Boiled until swollen, the gnocchi were heavy, dense, meant to fill a stomach for hours. No sauce, no embellishment, only the taste of bread reborn. This was the mantra. Never throw bread. Gnocchi di pane was not invention, but necessity made visible. A meal that honored patience and the refusal to let anything go to waste. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Number 3. Polenta frita, known as scagliozzi in the southern ports, was the meal built from yesterday's leftovers and the logic of survival. In the kitchens of Emilia-Romagna and the alleys of Bari, families would deliberately cook extra polenta, knowing that what remained could be sliced, left to firm overnight, and then fried in a pan the next morning. 3 ingredients: cornmeal, water, and oil, stretched across 2 days, transformed into something portable and filling. After the war, as men searched for work in the docks or along the railway lines, vendors received permits to sell these golden squares from battered carts. The fried polenta was not a festival treat, but a calculated calorie boost for laborers who might not see another meal until dusk. Municipal records from 1946 note the rise in street permits for scagliozzi vendors around Bari's port, a sign that hunger was still the city's main employer. Each batch was a lesson in planning ahead, in refusing to let a crumb go to waste, and in feeding those who could not stop to sit at a table. Polenta fritta stands as proof that endurance required not just thrift, but foresight, a meal made for moving, for working, for surviving on the margins. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. In second place, macchio stands as Sicily's thick answer to hunger, a puree of dried fava beans boiled with water and finished with a slow trickle of oil. In the cellars of 19th century Sicilian households, sacks of fava beans waited in the dark, insurance against the months when fields yielded nothing and bread grew scarce. Mothers soaked the beans overnight, then simmered them until skin split and the flesh collapsed into a paste soft enough for a child or an elder with no teeth. The oil, measured by the spoon, brought a faint richness to what was otherwise pure legume. No greens, no cheese, only the memory of sun and earth. Called the bread of our mothers in old diaries, macchio was the meal that could be swallowed when sickness or age made chewing impossible. Parish notes from the 1800s describe entire villages living on fava puree through winter, the pot thickening day by day as leftovers were reheated and stretched. There was no garnish, no pride, only the quiet dignity of making nourishment from what the land could store. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. And finally, in first place stands acqua e sale, the meal at the end of the line. In the darkest days of siege and evacuation, when even stale bread had vanished and ration cards yielded nothing but empty promises, mothers turned to water and a pinch of salt. Diaries from Palermo and Naples record the phrase acqua e sale, passed quietly from parent to child as both comfort and warning. There was no pretense of nourishment, only the act of filling a cup, dissolving a measured grain of salt, and handing it to a child whose hunger could not be answered. In the blackout nights of 1944, with the city under bombardment and food queues stretching for hours, this was not a dish, but a last defense against the pain of emptiness. Mothers portioned out salted water to quiet stomachs, sometimes pretending it was soup, sometimes offering it with nothing but a touch to the forehead. The act was not defeat, but a refusal to surrender the rituals of care. Acqua e sale is the absence of food made visible, the moment when survival meant enduring not just hunger, but the memory of what used to be a meal. There is no recipe here, only the dignity of persistence when all else has been stripped away. The kitchen that had no choice, the table set with nothing but patience and hope. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming. Across all 30 meals, one truth stands. Cucina povera was the kitchen that had no choice. Hunger, not invention, shaped these dishes. Endurance, thrift, and patience. These were the ingredients that kept families alive when there was nothing left. Today, what was once survival food is recast as heritage. But poverty needs no embellishment. Its taste lingers, heavy and unvarnished. Subscribe. More forgotten food history coming.